For anybody who's listening who might not be familiar with you, I mean, obviously you've been on Sam's show. I know you were in that documentary Hollywood DC by Sean Stone, which was an awesome documentary. You know, Sean's been on a few times.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, and then you know, you've been on a bunch of stuff. Obviously, you've done work with Richard Grove or whatnot. But for people who might not be familiar with you, can you give kind of like a brief background on you know, how you got into all this?
Yeah, I analyzed film. That's how it all started. It kind of branched out into other stuff, but I was blogging about some conspiracy topics maybe 10 years ago, and then I started doing more and more film analysis because I was doing that in my grad work at the same time, and then that blossomed into a book. So eventually, I got an offer for a book. Actually, it was after going on Sean's show, I got a publisher reach out. So then I did the book, and then we did a full production TV show on the basis of that book at Gaia TV, which you can find on Amazon Prime or whatever. So then I branched out, got roped into doing a lot of debates on philosophical topics, and then I got into doing more. I'm actually writing 2 books on philosophy right now, so it's kind of branched out. I also did a lot of geopolitics stuff. I wrote a lot of articles for 21st Century Wire for the last several years, and then did a lot of talks on geopolitical works. I did what I call the Globalism Books Talks, which is where I go through the top 40. So far, we've done in the last 3 years, 40 to 45 writings from the elite themselves. So it started with Tragedy and Hope. I did a lecture series through the totality of Tragedy and Hope, and then that branched out into all these other books, everything from CIA memoirs to Bertrand Russell to Huxley to all those key characters that we know had a hand in forming the 20th century, in our century. So that's mainly what I do now, and then I do a lot of comedic stuff as well. So I've been able to make friends with some pretty big name comedians, and we joke around and do some goofy stuff. So that's what I do.
Is there any topic that you're most passionate about or you like to discuss the most? Like the philosophy or conspiracies, or I know you've done a lot of religious kind of debates too.
I get passionate about those. So like I just debated the top Muslim guy in the world. We had a debate with him. That was pretty wild. I'm quite surprised he agreed to do it. I didn't think he would. I debated Matt Dillahunty, who's a pretty famous atheist on YouTube. Then I debated JF and people like that. I debated some other libertarians. Oh, what's his name? He's going to be mad. I forgot his name. I don't know.
Adam Kokesh?
Kokesh. I debated Kokesh.
Yeah,
Sorry about that. Anyway, but yeah, I'm passionate about it, but it's just actually, to me, it's more like a formal thing. It's not like that people think you have like this passion for debating. I mean, when I was in college, that's what we did. I was in the debate club. I was in philosophy club. That's what I studied. So to me, it was just kind of what you do. It wasn't like man, I can't wait to debate. And so I don't feel like that. But I like geopolitics a lot. I like comedic stuff a lot. I like making skits, doing retarded stuff. But so no, I don't have it. And I love doing the movie analysis too. So I like it all equally.
Yeah. Well, I think having a sense of humor is super important because, I mean, even Sam, I think that's one of the reasons why people love Sam's show.
Exactly.
Is the fact that he's talking about, you know, some serious issues and topics, but, you know, a dick joke will fly in from time to time, or he'll say something silly or whatnot. And
yeah, right.
which is necessary. I mean, honestly, almost accidentally, I mean, that's probably Alex Jones's thing too, right? I mean, like, he's talking about serious topics, but he's so over the top sometimes that I find myself laughing. You know, I'm like, he has to know that he's just being completely over the top, and that's, you know, where if you can be entertained, I mean, it's like Bill Hicks, George Carlin, you know, if they're sharing their philosophy, but in the same manner they're making you laugh and being silly about it, then you're much more likely to digest it and not feel offended by it than if you were just like, you know, lecturing.
Right. I've never had a problem with infotainment. I've always thought it was actually a good idea. I mean, isn't that what entertainment should be? I mean, nothing wrong with entertainment, but why not have entertainment that can also, you know, inform? That's what we tried to do with the TV show. We tried to basically take everything that was in my book and the work that Jay Widener did, and we combined it into, you know, analyzing film, but also have it in an entertaining, you know, presentation. So I think it worked. It was a little too cerebral for the audience, but yeah, I've always been pro infotainment.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, yeah, I think it can get dark. I've had Nick Bryan on, and we did
Yeah.
the whole podcast on the ranking scandal and everything related to it. And I gotta say, like I had a weird, like after that show, I was like not depressed, but I was kind of like, I don't know. I feel like I just came from a dark place, and talking about these dark topics, and it's not always easy, especially if you just get stuck in those topics and you're talking about them all the time. I mean, there's going to be psychological effects on you, I think. So I think being able to laugh and realize that the reason why we're kind of trying to expose this stuff is because we do believe in living our lives and happiness and finding love and all these things. And there's people who are being traumatized. There's people who are being or don't have the ability to do that, and are people who are taking our ability to do that, and that's what we're fighting against. And so we can't get so caught up with the fight that we, stop doing the things that we should be doing or trying to do, and that's enjoy life.
I learned that the hard way. I remember about 10 years ago when I first started looking into the dark occult pedo angle of stuff. I read a whole bunch of books on that. And I remember all I remember about that time period is I drank too much. So I was definitely, I mean, it does, if you only, look at that dark stuff constantly, you will get down. It will affect you. I mean, you can't not be affected by that kind of stuff. But I think that's a phase that you go through when you learn about how the world really works. You go through that phase of shock and awe, and then you kind of go through the maybe depressed phase for a little bit. And then once you kind of blossom out of that, when you've dealt with that, you can deal with it in the proper way. You're not as affected by it now that I mean, I don't want to say you're callous to it. That's the wrong word, but you can handle it, I guess, what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. No, I think I think everybody who's kind of went down some of these rabbit holes have had similar experiences where it gets really dark, it kind of depresses you, and then eventually you realize, like, okay, I can try to talk about these topics, expose these topics, share these topics, discuss them, but yet I can still separate that from everyday life. I mean, it'd probably be very similar to like a police officer or a good police officer who can detach himself from work. Some of my best friends are cops, and the good ones, like my friends are. It's because they can detach themselves from work. I mean, there's a reason why one of my best friends doesn't hang out with any cops, because he's like, all they want to do is talk shop. He's like, they don't know how to detach from it. And he wants to hang out with everybody who's not a police officer like myself. And because, we're not going to grill him about what happened at work or whatever. We're just going to hang out, and he can kind of, and same thing with a psychologist. Some people believe, I know there's been some stories, I remember research that I read years ago about people who got into psychology. Some of them, there's a percentage of them that got into it because they're trying to resolve their own issues, and they're trying to, soul search. And those are people who struggle, but the good ones are the people who can kind of, detach from maybe their own issues, or detach from, the patient's issues, and really be, and that's a hard thing to do. And I'm sure it comes in time. Surgeons, same thing, I mean, maybe there are people out there, the first time they cut somebody open, it's not a big deal, but, but I wonder if some of those instincts are crucial too, right? Like you're kind of numbing some primitive instincts that for survival purposes, that are there for survival purposes. Sometimes I'm curious about that, like not being afraid of blood, but who knows, but
my fiance is that way. Like, she can look at the grossest stuff, guts. Not that we have a lot of blood and guts around here, but like she can look at that, and like I've gotten now to the point where I'm 40, and if I see a cut, like my legs get weak. I feel like I'm gonna faint. I mean, I can't watch anything in a movie. I feel like such a wuss now, but I guess women are made that way because they give birth or whatever. So
yeah, well,
they're much better at being nurses, I guess, and dealing with guts everywhere or whatever. But I can hardly watch movies with like people getting cut or guts or whatever.
That's what makes some of the, like, when people look at some of the, what Sam would say, dark arts and some of the real occultish stuff, that stuff is pretty deranged and weird. Like when I know the Pizzagate thing got a lot of traction, and then a lot of people were like, oh, there's, Pizzagate's is a hoax and all this stuff, and it's like, well, kind of, because it is and it isn't, because it's like,
Yeah.
well, was there people, were there kids being trafficked in that pizza shop? Probably not, but there was definitely some weird shit about the owner. There's some weird shit, connections to politicians. If you look at his Instagram page, like all those weird pictures. I mean, I have kids, like that shit was weird. Like, and being a parent, it only made it weirder, because I'm like, I would never take a picture like that with my child and put it online. And so yeah, I probably should have a question, but I just figured for some reason that came to mind.
Well, I did a video about how crazy the art world is. I mean, a lot of people have seen that documentary from Netflix recently about how it's used for a lot of money laundering, the high art world. But yeah, I mean, I followed all that stuff, and I knew about all of the, Epstein and all that stuff for a long time too, and the Franklin cover-up stuff that you talked about. And I also researched the Roman Catholic pedo scandals for many, many years as well. So I have a whole shelf on all that. But so I knew about it, and it wasn't surprising. I'm not sure that I think that sometimes the media will run, or PR campaigns can run fake stories to help disseminate a certain story. So this is a tactic in PR where you can, if you know that a leak is going to come out that's damaging to, say, your political candidate, you can sort of cut them off of the pass by leaking something that relates to that case that's absurd or fake. So then once all this has blown up and it's absurd and fake, when the real stuff comes out, it's attached to the fake stuff. You see what I'm saying? That's a PR tactic that people can do. So I think that might have been going on in that situation, to where it was exaggerated, and then there was real stuff going on that was covered up. There was a movie that Jessica Chastain was in where they actually did that. The PR company was hired to, create these fake things for some political candidate that was in some trouble. Anyway, but the high art world, I think, is interesting too, because there's a lot of elite deviancy in that world, beyond just the money stuff. I also think there's a pretty dark component to that world. I had an ex-girlfriend who was into that stuff. Well, she was into the art, but her sister was actually a graduate from Vanderbilt in art, and that was all it was like, she was tasked with her whole project for her graduate degree was like creating giant wombs with like nails inside of babies. And it was just like, what? I mean, that's the degeneracy of that high art world. It just, something just is demonic about it. I don't know how to describe it. And the school that I went to for my philosophy work, grad work, we have a pretty prominent art department too. So I would go over there because I had friends in that department, and I would see a lot of the exhibits that the seniors were putting out. And it was the same way. It was like, now I'm not trying to be some kind of Puritan. I mean, I'm not a Puritan. I think people should have the freedom to make different types of art, but I also have the freedom to call it out as disgusting and gross. And it was the same way for years at my university. It was just the art that they would put out would be just really dark, demonic, gross stuff. And I started wondering, like, why is everybody making, and nobody makes beautiful art. Nobody made anything beautiful. And then you find out that the teachers at that university, they're all a bunch of weirdos that are obsessed with death, and they're in death cults and stuff like that. I'm not joking, like people into like really hardcore dark stuff. So we've just allowed, in our society, these really dark people to get up into the echelons. They have no qualms. And I think ultimately, you may disagree. I don't know what your take is, but I mean, I think there's a spiritual component to it. I mean, all the geopolitical conspiracy stuff is true, but when you get into that dark pedo type stuff, one of the guys who wrote about all the Vatican stuff, he said that, when you look at this stuff in the Vatican, he says what the only conclusion I could come to is that there's actually a dark sort of satanic component that's involved in this. I'm not talking about LaVey. I'm talking about real dark stuff, because the goal of what they're doing is actually to defile innocence, and that they think there's a power in the defiling of innocence. Then that is something that is uniquely demonic beyond just, Anton LaVey wearing a suit or something.
Yeah, that well, you figure, remember that film? I think it was Hostel. Remember, it was a horror film. every time I talk about topics like this, it reminds me of that film because it's a possible explanation, right? So you have these people who are filthy rich who like Bill Gates, for example, right? James Corbett's done a great little, documentary series on recently. Yeah, and it's one of those things where he has all the power and money, or he has all the money in the world, all the financial things he could have. He's probably been to every exotic island, has bought every material thing that you could get some pleasure out of. What's next, right? Like you need, I remember that poker guy, that guy who's always taking pictures with hot girls and
Dan Bilzerian.
Yeah, when he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, it wasn't that thought provoking, but there was one aspect of the conversation that stuck with me, and he was talking about how, and it was this dilemma, right? Like you look at him and it's like he has all these great things, and like, oh my God, how awesome is that? But he was using this example of like, okay, if I drive a Pinto, if I buy that Mustang, that I always wanted, it might be used, might be a couple years old, but it's such an upgrade from that Pinto that my pleasure, goes from 0 to 10. So it's in pleasure value, it's like a 10. I'm really satisfied. I'm really happy. I'm excited. And then, if I get a Mercedes, SL 500, oh my God, like what a upgrade then from the last thing. So my pleasure goes to 10. And then it gets to the point where like you start having everything go to a 10, and you start having everything, get there. You're going to get to a point where like nothing can get you there anymore, where you almost can't be happy anymore, or you can't be, maybe happy is not the right word, but you know what I'm trying to say? Like it's hard to
get I've got a bunch of hoes that live in my basement, and I've got 10 of them, and I always want 20. Once I've got 10 hoes, I want 20 hoes. And then I feed the hoes ramen noodles. That's all that I let them subsist just on ramen noodles. And then when I give them ramen noodles, they want turkey sandwiches. I'm like, you damn hoes. No, that was really dumb, but
it was a very deep metaphor.
It was a deep metaphor to describe the never-ending spiral of degeneracy that you're speaking of here. That the whole never, you just keep going deeper, deeper. And I think Solomon speaks this way in Ecclesiastes. He says that it never ends. It never ends. But yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. So when you get to the point of somebody like a Soros or a Bill Gates, I mean, every conceivable pleasure that you've wanted has been met. So what else is there other than to go into the darker stuff, I guess? And I remember Eli Roth did say that he claimed, at least, that when he made Hostel and the sequels, that he had overheard some Singaporean elite or somewhere in Thailand or somewhere, he'd heard these really wealthy people talking about that they like to do that. They like to hire, pay some person to kidnap, and then they get to like do whatever they want with somebody, and that they felt like that was like the height of their sort of psychopathic desires or whatever. But all this goes together, seeing destruction as art, psychopathy, that level of will to power, that level of being able to satisfy one's passions and desires, it all goes together. And the irony is that it's self-destructive. Like it's not, you get all the stuff that you want and you think that's going to make you happy, and it doesn't, because in my view, we're made for more than just material, physical satisfaction.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. There's we're roughly the same age. I'm 35. But we grew up probably in the same era of music, and there's this band. Actually, I'm from Massachusetts. There's a band that's not too far from here called Hatebreed. I don't know if you remember them. And,
I know of them, yeah.
Yeah, they had an album called "Satisfaction Is the Death of Desire," and I remember when I was a kid and that album came out, I'm like, "Satisfaction is the death of desire," and I remember just pondering on that. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, it's simple, but yeah, it's like this. It's a huge like dilemma. Like it's a huge issue in your life that like how do you continue keeping that desire? And because eventually that desire is going to motivate you to get whatever you're trying to pursue, and then you're satisfied and desire's gone, and and then you have to find something else, and it's just
yeah. If you read about serial killers and the psychos, they'll talk about how they don't feel anything normally until they're doing something really horrendous, and then they feel stuff. They feel things in a really intense way. So it's almost like a kind of, people have compared it to drug addiction as well, that the dopamine's released through, power or perceived power are like that with cocaine. So my guess is that at a chemical level, there's an addiction that's there, and then at a spiritual level, it's something more. It's actually that you've given away more and more of your conscience, more and more of your soul for perceived pleasures. But again, it's just putting you more and more into a trap. It's trapping you because you think you're free, but you're actually more and more enslaved to things that don't actually fulfill you.
Yeah, it's weird because I brought this up when I don't know if it was when Dr. Christopher Ryan was on, because I've heard him talk about it, or and I know I brought it up when Nick Bryan was on, and then he didn't seem to like to discuss this too much because it is a little controversial. But the idea of, like, I almost feel bad for the criminal at times because and I say that in regards to when you find out that they were a victim, because what ends up happening in a lot of these cases is you do see a molested child eventually become a child molester, and you see this cycle, right? And it's like, when do we stop feeling bad for them, and then we start, it's this weird dilemma. At least I have this dilemma where it's like, in a way, it's like they didn't have a fair shot because they are dealing with trauma. Okay, something happened to them that created this psychological, issue that maybe they're stimulated by this act or whatever it may be, sexually stimulated, who knows? But yet you still want to dislike them for doing what they're doing. And it is this weird internal dilemma. I remember bringing this up, and I think it was Nick Bryan who kind of felt like, no, they're still responsible. And it's like, no, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying there is this thing where it's like, you see it over and over again, right? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, no, I totally understand. I mean, this is in theology, we make a distinction between the person, who they are in themselves, the soul, and then their actions. So, actions are what hurt you or damage others. It's not the individual, the being themselves is not inherently evil. When we say, oh, so-and-so is evil, we're speaking of the actions that they're prone to or that they commit. But in our view, evil is a specific action of the will. So you can't, quote, be evil. We're not Manichaeans. We're not Zoroastrians. Creatures aren't inherently evil. So being evil is when you're committing those evil actions. And so if you're, prone to those things, then what we can hate in people is those actions. We don't hate the people themselves. Yeah,
I like that explanation. The thing is, too, that's what I love about philosophy. And I remember watching your Stefan Molyneux debate and whatnot. And I have like this love-hate relationship with him because sometimes he says stuff that I think is thought-provoking and beneficial. Then other times I think he's running a cult. But so and I guess you don't have to agree with somebody 100% of the time to feel like there's some benefit in it. But I actually haven't seen much of his work. I've kind of stopped listening to him. I was never a huge fan, but I'd always kind of keep track of what was going on. But when he would debate somebody like you or have somebody on, like even I think he had Dan Carlin on once, I would listen to those shows because I thought it might make for an interesting conversation. But I think what makes those debates about philosophy, there's a great debate, and it wasn't, I don't think it was supposed to be a debate, and it's like this gem of a podcast that nobody really, it never picked up or got a lot of attention, but it was Sam Harris and Dan Carlin. They did a podcast together. Did you listen to that?
No, but
wicked fascinating. And they start off really complimenting each other, and then and I knew they had completely different views because Dan Carlin looks at things much from a historical perspective, and then eventually they get in this debate. And what I love about debates like that, when people are challenging each other's ideas, especially when people are willing to let their ideas be challenged, and obviously you are, because you have a lot of debates. I think we realize there's way more questions than there are answers, and I think that's what I love about philosophy is that it makes you, like, you can get so stuck in this conspiracy world and all this stuff, but how often do we stop and try to figure out, like, what's the origins of my thoughts? What's the origins of my ideas? Like, I feel this way, but do I feel this way because of something that's happened in my life, because I'm some outside influences? all this stuff. And that's what I love about. And I mean, I barely graduated high school. Unfortunately, I started working right out of high school, and just kind of, for a lack of a better term, got stuck in the real world of that cycle. And that was one of my motivations to start the podcast, was because I didn't want to believe I couldn't do something, and I wanted to start my own ripple, and I didn't know what it was, but I knew I am, I'm at least, one thing I'm good at is holding a conversation, or some people would say talking too much, but I would like to say starting or holding a conversation. But either way, like I wanted to feel like I could do something and do something that was fulfilling to some sense, and really, like, philosophy and all these things that I would dive into. It made me ask questions that I think a lot of times you can get stuck in that rhythm and really never stop and ask. And is that one of the reasons why you really were fascinated with philosophy?
I'm not sure why I got into philosophy, actually. I mean, for me, it was always kind of closely connected to bigger questions, religious questions. I was raised Baptist, which is not very interested in the philosophical side of things usually. But as I got older, when I went to college, I really originally wanted to study theology or religion, and then my university locally only had philosophy, so I just chose that. And I did like philosophy. I'd read some by that point when I was 19, 18 or so. But what you're hitting on, I think, is key, is that there's a natural affinity between people who are truth seekers, truth community, and philosophy, because we're asking questions. I mean, that's essentially what, if you go back to the origin of Western philosophy, if you go back to Plato, to the Apology, that's what Socrates is doing. He's asking questions. Well, what is the purpose of all this? What is the good life? What is the meaning of this? Like, what is truth? What is justice? What is beauty? Those are all the fundamental questions that are not just out there. They're actually questions for each one of us. So we should be asking ourselves those questions. That's the point of the Apology. A lot of people think the point of the Apology is, oh, it's just Socrates sort of wandering around the town like a gadfly, just pestering people and shop owners and politicians and asking them about, like, what's the meaning of what you're doing? What he's doing is actually trying to probe people to get them to question their own lives and to say, why am I doing what is my purpose? Like, what is this? And most people don't want to do that, right? Most people are mad at him for doing that, but he's actually doing them a favor. That's the irony here, is that just like the allegory of the cave, they don't want to know. A lot of people, not everybody, but most people don't want to come out of the cave. They want to stay. That's the sad part of human nature, is that we tend to want to assume that we're always right. We want to stay stuck in our paradigm, in our box. And his whole method of what he's trying to do with questioning everybody is to get them to question themselves. And a lot of people mistakenly think that means, oh, so it's just relativism, man. He wants you to just, like, nothing's true, because, like, no, the point is to question your assumptions so that you can come closer to truth with a capital T, to objective realities, objective notions. I mean, that's the whole point of Platonic philosophy, is to refute sophistry, skepticism, relativism. So whether he does that is a different question, but that's at least the goal, the purpose of what's trying to occur here. And I think that I started noticing in my own life, even before I'd read the Apology, I was kind of on that track anyway, not tooting my horn. I'm just, we're all made different ways. Not everybody's made to do that, right? If somebody wants to remain in the matrix, be a shopkeeper or whatever, and just say that that's the meaning of life, that's what they have the freedom to do that. But if you have that questioning onus within you, then I think you are naturally drawn to philosophy. And what you said about education, what I've learned as I've gotten older is that there's always pros and cons either way. Sometimes I look back and I wish that I had not gone to grad school and done philosophy, because if I had started doing what I do now back then, I could have 1 million followers, right? I wouldn't be stuck at 50, 60, 100,000 followers with, on social. I could have a bigger audience if I had focused doing what I do back then, rather than putting all that time and energy into university. However, the pros of that is that you will be forced to be exposed to ideas and material that you wouldn't have been exposed to if you were your own teacher. So there are advantages to having the university exposure, in the sense of, I probably never would have read all these atheists that I didn't really care about if I hadn't been forced to read them, to write countless papers and essays on them over the years of doing that. So there's pros and cons either way, but don't feel bad that not that you do feel bad, but it's a trade-off. I mean, most of the time, by the way, in the university system, as I'm sure you know, I've interviewed Brett a couple times. I've been on with him. We know about the public education system anyway as brainwashing. So you didn't miss out in the sense of being brainwashed. The only thing that you could have missed out on was just maybe exposure. But who knows? I don't even know what you would have gone to school for. I mean, nowadays, if you choose liberal arts, it's like you got to study, women's clitoral issues in South Africa, and feminist rights. Like, what does that have to do with the liberal arts, right? Like, you want to go study Plato? No, you need to learn about, clitoral rights in South Africa.
What about all these gender studies? And this stuff is getting so ridiculous. I forget what the two guys are, the ones who made up these, they were proving
fake papers.
Yeah, the fake papers. I got it. Somebody who went to school with me who I believe she's a psychologist now. We got in a debate about some of this stuff, and I'm just like, peer review doesn't mean jack shit. I'm like, it doesn't, like, James Corbett did a great video on the crisis of science, and that's one of the things that he discussed in that video was just how, all the manipulation, how you can get anything you want, all the examples of people who came up with bullshit studies just for the purpose of showing, like, hey, I can get anything published. And in the cases of the gender studies guys, the more ridiculous they made it, because
the better they did.
I'm like, that is insane, and it's a huge issue.
Wasn't one of them like discrimination against gay dogs in dog parks or something?
Yeah.
There's something ridiculous like that. But yeah, that's illustrative, and ironically, I mean, I saw Corbett's thing. That was great what he did on that. We've been talking about that a lot too in my sphere, because one of the things I studied was philosophy of science. And that's more so about the assumptions of science than the actual legwork of science itself. It's a whole discipline that's really fascinating. But you'll read things like Thomas Kuhn and Structures of Scientific Revolution, and you'll read Plantinga and all these people. And what you start to realize really quickly is that science is not the objective thing that we think it is. Which is not to say that there aren't scientists doing scientific work. Obviously there are. But from my vantage point, people doing engineering, that kind of stuff, that's real science. That's because you have to produce results. You can't just sit back and make up nonsense in science fiction and call it science. But in the realm of what you're talking about, peer review, I mean, the Lancet said 4 or 5 years ago that half of probably the studies that are out there are forged or false in terms of their, that's prestigious medical journals saying that the materials are forged and false in terms of at least 50%. And it could be more, who knows? And then the guys that you're talking about, those two guys, that even backs it up further. So I knew about that because we actually had classes where we looked at an analysis of error in science, large-scale errors in science, scientific revolutions with Kuhn. And Kuhn shows you that the paradigms in science don't come about on the basis of the scientific council all getting together and with total altruistic, desire for whatever the truth is. Everybody just gives up all their theories because somehow when you put on a lab coat, you become like neutral and you don't have any of the normal human desires for funding and pride like everyone else. You become neutral magically. It's a magical lab coat. No, we've been calling that out for a long time because humans are humans. They can be manipulated, and shocker, the science world is part of the establishment as well. And so they have set agendas. They're very much under the control of the power structure for the most part. And it's very compartmentalized too. Science is hyper specialized. So for example, I'm a big questioner of Darwinism. We analyze and question Darwinism a lot at my website and in my videos. But let's say for the sake of argument that whether you're pro or a critic of Darwin, I mean, you can have a paradigm in your system, your paradigm can be fundamentally wrong, but you can still make correct discoveries in the minutiae or in the particulars, right? And I can prove that very easily by just the fact that there are scientists who are theists and there are scientists who are Darwinians who both make correct discoveries. So we can have wrong paradigms and still within particulars, or you're studying mice or something, and you learn how the mice ears work or something like that, and still have the wrong paradigm. So that's why what I focus on philosophically is presuppositions and paradigms, because that's really the way that we interpret the world, is through a lens or a paradigm or basic philosophical assumptions.
Yeah, and what you said is so important, because we when people, everybody likes to make every topic political, and the right thinks that, government is the root of all evil. The left thinks corporations are the root of all evil. And I'm like, well, they all have something in common. People run it, and guess what? People are flawed. And the thing is, like you said, when you're a doctor, when you're a police officer, when you're a priest, we put them on this pedestal, like they have this moral compass that is beyond our understanding, that they like, for example, if we've all heard situations where people have to go to court and they're like, oh, it's the police officer's word against yours. And we all consume that statement by thinking like, holy crap, if it's my word against a police officer, there's no way I'm going to win this, or the judge is going to go. And it's like, why we decide as a society that if you have a badge and a gun, all of a sudden you must be morally a better person. And especially when a lot of the training has to do with just being able, it has nothing to do with like psychological, there's probably some, but very little. And also when you have that type of power, it does have a psychological effect on you. Some people can handle it, some people can't. I mean, I'm sure you're very familiar with the Stanford study, where they built, created like a fake prison or whatever, and you could see people who are psychologically normal or sane or whatnot, they had issues with dealing with that power. And so I don't think everybody is designed the same way. And a doctor, probably very similar in regards to everybody respecting you. You're surrounded by a bunch of yes men because you have this diploma and you have this, whatever it may be, you're put on this pedestal. And psychologically, it's going to have effect on your ego. It's going to have effect on the way you do things, like you said. So when scientists are doing studies, and we like to think that they're completely just, there's no way that ego or money or any of these outside influences can be affecting, the outcome, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, an easy way to disprove that, which most people don't know about or think about. So my mom used to be an editor. She was an editor for science journals for Harcourt Brace, which is like the biggest publisher in the U.S. She did that for like 20 years. And one thing that I learned from her was that who do you think publishes and is sort of over all of this scientific journal stuff? A giant billion-dollar publishing company that, I don't know if they still do. At the time, they owned SeaWorld, right? So it's like this huge conglomerate that owns a bunch of publishing. I mean, they didn't just publish. She worked in the scientific section, journal section, but they published everything. They published textbooks. So you have this giant billion-dollar corporation. I'm not making this into a left political, private, public. That's not the point. The point is that you have a centrally controlled giant billion-dollar corporation that decides what is published, how it's published, right? And these are this is sent in from all over the world. Like my mom used to have the hardest time trying to figure out the broken English of people from other countries trying to write about, these really hyper specified scientific topics. So there you have it right there. The one easy way to show that it's not like you just, the university picks whoever's the smartest person and then they go and then they can write a paper and then they put it in a journal. It doesn't work like that. I mean, the whole peer review process is itself, I mean, on one level, it makes sense why it would be that way. But at the same time, you realize that, well, this is actually rife for abuse, especially if you know how ridiculous the education system is. I mean, a lot of people think I'm an idiot, right? Which is fine. You can think I'm an idiot. I'm a retard. But I have a peer review published paper. So that proves that the whole system is wrong if you think I'm a retard. Because I'm a retard who has a peer review published paper. So there you go. That just proves the whole thing.
Do you really have a peer review? What's the topic on?
My grad work was on James Bond and how he's used in propaganda. So I did my master's on psychological warfare and propaganda. So using pop culture figures as Cold War propaganda. So I had a big fight with my thesis advisor. So only 1/3 of the paper got written, and then I just took that and published it in peer review. So yeah, you can, if you, it's the American Journal of Economics and Sociology. You can go find the paper if you look it up. But anyway, the point is that that whole process, and it's a little bit different for sciences maybe than it is for the humanities. So maybe it's a little easier. I don't know anything. I mean, I'm not published in science, so I didn't study science at a university level, so I don't know what the process of scientific peer review. But as you pointed out with the guys who making up the fake studies, I mean, to me, it looks ridiculous. The whole thing looks silly.
Yeah, it does. And like you said, it's not to say that there isn't some good research and stuff
Sure.
being reviewed. It just means that it can be manipulated, and not everything that, I mean, there's a reason why some people get a second opinion from doctors. It's
Yeah.
because they don't all agree on the same thing. And that's the way the world should be. Like if we both watch, or we, okay, for example, because I grew up loving music and playing music, if we both listen to the same song, we might have completely different interpretations of what the song means, or the feeling of the song, or the movie, or the artwork, whatever it may be. And that's okay. This idea that, like, you know, this doctor or this person said this, so it must be true. And that's, you know, it's funny because growing up, so I'm Portuguese. I was born in Portugal, came to America young. My parents Catholic, you know, I was raised Catholic, went to Sunday school and all that stuff. And then I rebelled, got into, you know, heavy metal and did everything that was anti-Portuguese, anti-Catholic. I never touched, you know, I didn't touch a soccer ball again until I was an adult. You know, it was like the most un-Portuguese thing you could do. And it's weird. I almost came back around, right? Because, like, so I left this group, right? I left this group of Catholics that I disliked, and the reason why I liked philosophy was because philosophy was all about asking questions. It embraced asking questions, and religion wasn't asking any questions. And if you did ask questions, you'd get in trouble, like I did many times, right? I would get, you know, they didn't like when you were really trying to dissect their meanings and things and stuff like that. At least that was, you know, my experience, and I think many Catholics experience.
Do you have the story of the nuns that spanked your hand? Is that what you're talking about?
No, I didn't, luckily. But so and then, like, and I got really obsessed with atheism and, you know, obviously the Richard Dawkins, the Christopher Hitchens, all that stuff. And so I get into that, and it all makes sense to me. And then eventually I'm like, I think I might have left a group because it was cultish to join another group that seems kind of cultish, you know? And I realized that, like, I left a group to join another group, and they're doing the exact same thing that I didn't like the other group was doing, right? And in regards to, like, not being open-minded to all perspectives and opinions and ideas, not giving any, not admitting that there might be some good in the other people's perspectives, and some good might come out of it. I mean, when you had, you know, for example, one thing that was really kind of eye-opening to me was Christopher Hitchens, when he was, you know, talking about how religion is the root of all evil, it's brainwashing and all this stuff. And then when he didn't realize that dislike of religion was also being used to justify unjust wars in the Middle East. And I'm just like, no, you're missing the point. Like, this isn't a religious fight. This is about geopolitics. This is about, you know, control of resources and territories. Yeah, and right. you're blinded by your dislike of religion. And in that case, it was, you know, Muslim religion. But it was, to me, like, I could see, like, okay, you've created some blind spots. You know, it's, you know, I joined, or I got intrigued with atheism because I thought they were open-minded and they were more willing to ask questions. And I realized, like, oh, no, they're kind of blinded too by their own philosophy and opinions. And then as I got older, like, the more I realized, like, those bigger questions that some of us might really enjoy in philosophy, like asking the questions of, like, what's life about, what's the meaning of all this stuff. Some people were finding those questions, or being forced those questions, through religion. Like, I have friends that are Polish or whatever, you know, whatever you know, country they're from, and they grew up religious. And going to church, one thing that I still remember is that they would tell you to be nice to people. And I mean, these things that we all obviously understand, and tell you about family and friends and happiness and all this stuff. And I think we can get so caught up in like this capitalistic material world where it's all about like getting ahead that we lose. Some people need those reminders. We lose what's really important. You know, we lose that like, okay, getting those material things are great, but there's bigger questions. There's bigger meanings to our life than just, you know, trying to gather as much material things as possible. And for some people, religion helps them stop, pump the brakes, maybe that hour at church or whatever, and ask those questions. In many cases, those aren't people who are going to ask those questions because they're reading philosophy. They might never be intrigued or exposed to philosophy, but religion can give them.
Have you read Nietzsche? You had your Nietzschean revelation.
Well, no, actually, I haven't read Nietzsche, but
well, what you're saying is what Nietzsche says. It's either Genealogy of Morals or Ecce Homo. He says that when he looks at the religious sphere of the evangelical, you need to convert everybody to your view. He says, and then when he looked at atheism, he said the atheists are all a bunch of evangelical atheists. He said they're all pale-faced missionaries who want to convert everybody. He said so it's the exact same modus operandi, and he said that really, if you think about it, if you're an atheist, why do you even care? Like, what, you know, why does it matter to that you need to, you know, make everybody more rational, more reasonable, or whatever? And so he's just illustrating the point that there's the same sort of dogmatism that can occur in any paradigm, any perspective, any worldview that you have, whether you're a theist or whether you're, you know, one of the new atheists or Dawkins or Hitchens or whoever, where you feel like you need to sort of go on a crusade. But if atheism is true, why do you need to go on a crusade? Like, why does it even matter? You said, well, but you want to make life better. For what does that mean, make life better? I mean, why do you need to make life better? It doesn't. I mean, that just assumes, you know, value judgments, purpose, telos, all those things that are not immediately apparent prima facie what that is or why it matters. So, yeah, I totally agree. I think that I never had an atheist phase per se. I had periods in my life where I just kind of didn't really care about theology or church or anything like that. But I never really went into the atheist phase because I had a strange introduction into philosophy where my introduction to it when I was like 19, 20 was through paradigm level critiques. So I kind of entered the world of philosophy precisely at the point that would critique what you're getting at, where if you look at philosophy at a paradigm level, presuppositional level, that we all have fundamental assumptions in the world of epistemology and metaphysics and in ethics, the three branches of philosophy. If you look at it from that perspective, then you know kind of at the outset that there's no person that's in a privileged position, right? So in epistemology, this is about the assumption of a privileged epistemic starting point. Nobody has that. Like we all have the same limitations, which is not to say that you can't necessarily get to objective truth, but we all have limitations. So there's no privileged position by which you can sit back and judge all claims, because all claims are situated within some worldview or paradigm. So if you get into paradigm philosophy or, you know, that level of philosophy, in my view, it actually makes things a lot easier to analyze because there's no system that is neutral. There's no neutrality. Every system, every piece of knowledge that you have, every act of predication is theory laden. It's situated within a paradigm. And if you understand that, then the simpler approach, I would say, to philosophy is just to compare the paradigms. So that's what, every time I debate, I'm doing the exact same thing. It never changes. All I'm doing at any point is comparing paradigms as a whole.
Yeah, and that Dan Carlin, Sam Harris debate that I discussed, it was a similar thing where him being an atheist and his dislike of religion had him, it made it hard for him to understand what Dan Carlin was trying to say. And like, for example, he was talking about freeing Muslim people from covering their faces. And Dan Carlin's like, well, if you grow up like that, they might not feel like they need to be freed. You've decided that your culture is the answer to everybody. The way you live is the right way of living, but that's not true, you know? And, you know, it's similar to, he was talking about, and it's been a long time since I listened to this, so I don't remember all the things they did discuss, but it was really thought-provoking. And, you know, he was talking about how throughout history, there's always been people who kill other people, and they'll say it's because of we're defending our freedoms, or we're defending our whatever, and it's in the disguise of something that's not really true. And in many cases, religion is one of those things. We say it's because we're for these religious reasons, but those who are actually in power are just trying to stay in power, and it's not really because of religious reasons. And like we talked about with art, right? Like one person can read the Bible and find all the most violent things of the Old Testament and use that to justify their actions. And somebody else can read it and say that, I found a lot of things that help me figure out my moral compass and what life's about and all this stuff. So it's not inherently good or bad or evil or or whatnot. So it's I think those are all super important, because I think a lot of times we do become tribal and people turn on each other. I mean, that's like even like the race discussion, right? Anytime people talk about race, I'm always like, listen, I'm Portuguese, and on our Portuguese national team, there's black.
You are the ones that really control the world. You're a Portuguese supremacist, aren't you, dude?
Well, we were. I mean, we are one of the first people who had slaves and stuff. Why some people have said have highlighted that, and I'm like, yeah, we're not.
So hold on, let me get my calculator out. Let's see that. How do we total the reparations for the 16 generations back slaveholders? Yeah.
Well, that's a very good point, because the thing is too, right? I mean, if you look at the history of eugenics and all that stuff, I mean, and even before that, race has always been, or in many cases has been, a way of just people to basically say we're better than you because of either, in some cases they think there was scientists that would say, hey, white people are just smarter than these people, they, which is another example of science kind of being a bullshit at times. And but it's also very debatable, because it's like, okay, is race really important? Or are we just it's just color, right? But it doesn't mean like Eminem obviously is white. He's in that culture of hip hop and whatnot. Like, just because his skin's not black, is he any less accepted into that culture, or any less a good representative of that culture? To me, if in like Portugal, for example, if I go to Portugal, I meet somebody who's black, they grew up eating Portuguese food, they grew up watching soccer, we talk about soccer, we talk about all the things that people who grew up the same way and listen to the same things and grew up in the same culture would talk about. We obviously would have a lot of similarities. I don't give a shit if he's black or not. To me, he's still Portuguese, right? So it's like, him being black to me isn't really that important. Brazilians, for example, Brazilians, like, what are Brazilians? Brazilians are Portuguese people, went there, they killed a lot of the natives, but they also mated with a lot of the natives and brought a lot of African slaves there to work on the sugar fields. And they mated. So then you have Brazilians that are like, look African. You have Brazilians like Tom Brady's wife, who looks Portuguese because her ancestors are probably more likely from Portugal. So like, if we lived in Brazil, what the fuck's a black person? What the fuck's a white person? Like, how do you, it's like, it can get confusing, and then it's like, well, people dislike, Muslims, for obviously the U.S. has been doing a great job of making like everybody believe that if you're from a Muslim country, you must be a terrorist. So that's a sense of racism, right? Like, now a lot of people are being, kind of.
Well, yeah, there's a gigantic portion of the Arab world that are Christians.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, in the Orthodox world, there's tons of Orthodox churches in the Middle East. I mean, significant portions of Middle Eastern people are Christians or Orthodox or even Catholic. So, yeah, I mean, that's just sort of based on naivety and ignorance. But yeah, you're hitting on some really like nuanced, difficult, complex questions, because whether or not to what extent people groups exist as a grouping is itself a philosophical question. To what extent culture and language are metaphysically real things or just inventions is itself a pretty interesting debate. I would say that if you're talking about in the ancient world, you're talking about the Old Testament, stuff like that. I think in the ancient, medieval and ancient world, people viewed things like, if your culture was an empire, then you obviously had the power and the supremacy, the knowledge, the engineering to win the war, to set up the empire, to run it. So in that sense, the superiority wasn't solely genetic or something like that. There would be a genetic component, presumably, depending on which people group was in dominance, Persians, Greeks, whoever. But at the same time, how we view those things is also going to be read through our paradigm of whether we believe, for example, collective groupings are real or not. So if a person was in a really strict, say, libertarian mindset where they only believed in, say, the quote individual, if you have that perspective, then you would argue that all the collective groupings are merely social constructs and just the accidents of history, right? Brazilians, well, they just happen to be this country with imaginary borders. It's called Brazil, and that just came about whenever in history. And so you would view all history that way, as sort of these arbitrary lines on maps. But it depends, because I'm not arguing either way. I have a specific view, but I'm saying that what I would ask a libertarian is that if that's the case, then wouldn't it stand to reason that all collective groupings, biological as well, are also therefore constructs? I mean, it stands to reason that gender would also be a construct, right? Because if we're going to say that everything that's located in biology is purely a construct, and if it's only skin color, then aren't the organs or whatever? I mean, in other words, the same argument would apply to other aspects of human physiognomy as well, which I think that's where it gets problematic, because I don't think that gender is a construct. I'm not saying you're saying that. I'm just saying that people that have that argument, they could argue in that way. Now, I know that a libertarian would probably say, well, but I can make a distinction between a person's biological gender features and their, lineage or genetics or whatever. But actually, the more if you look deeper into genetic issues, it's not as clear cut how those things are that distinct, because the same genetic features, chromosomes, et cetera, that are going to be involved in determining your gender, they're also going to be coming as part of this packaged whole from your ancestors, right? So I'm not saying that means that, therefore we should be racists. I'm saying that it's a more complex question than when it's situated in this you're either racist or not perspective. And yeah, so I can admit that there's absolutely an element to which people, their cultures or civilizations, there's a relativistic fuzzy area to where it is lines drawn on a map, but at the same time, not everything is a construct. I mean, there's a clear difference between a white dude and a sub-Saharan African and a guy in China. There's clearly differences between not just the individual physiognomy, but also between the cultures that they produce. This is why I think there's a lot of insights in Russian philosophers like Ivan Ilyin, people like this, who write on the history of culture that are opposed to the fascist sort of race-based perspective of Darwinism, which I would reject, but at the same time recognizing that people groups do have their unique cultures and their contributions that are not purely external. They in a way express the soul of a people. Language is a great example of this, and so there is some flexibility where people can say a Chinese guy can go to Russia and he can learn Russian and he can be he can change his language, but there's still an aspect to him that didn't change. So these are really, really deep, complex questions. But I don't subscribe to the Darwinian racial groupings or the Malthusian, dysgenics perspective. I would just say that the older perspectives that we had prior to that, where you have to understand what Darwinism did, is that it destroyed metaphysics and it tried to make everything metaphysical into pure biology. And that causes a lot of problems in philosophy. So I would say more like somebody like Spengler, that there are the people groupings do have and express collective realities, and we could, for example, speak of the soul of a people. That would be my critique of sort of the libertarian excess of the atomistic individual. But I'm not saying that everybody should be part of a collective. I'm not a communist. I'm not a Marxist. I just think that these are really nuanced areas. Anyway, I'm rambling.
No, but I'm glad you're rambling, because it gives me a break from rambling. but no, I love what you said, because I think these are so intriguing to talk about and discuss. And I think in many cases nobody goes that deep. Everything's like surface level. It's like you're either racist or not racist. There's blacks or there's whites. It's like it's not that simple. And that was kind of my point of using Brazilians as a example. And is that,
well, I mean, take Chinese and Japanese. I mean, you have two different. I mean, obviously they have some common lineage. We don't know what that is. But you got two people groups. Do they have degenerate elites? Yes, both of them do. Do they both, in some sense, also though want to protect their group? They do, and they'll have laws about immigration and so forth. So the question is, I mean, there's no easy answer to that, right? I mean, how do you there's no easy either or solution to, on the one hand, should Japanese people have a right to maintain Japanese culture? It seems like yes. But on the other hand, does that allow for abuse on the part of the elite that run that country? Sure. So there's no that's the thing with geopolitics and history, is that it's always way more complex than we think, and there's not easy answers to any of these questions. The more sophisticated, the deeper you get into these topics. But the unfortunate thing is that what you're hitting on is that in today's politics, it is oversimplified to be politicized, to be this weaponized thing, to where you can't even get into the deep side of it. You have to just be on this surface level. You're supposed to be triggered by the racial stuff. That's the whole point of it.
And that's where the self-censorship is a huge issue. I mean, it's a huge issue with so many topics, but especially with race, because it's one of those things where if you ask any question or have a discussion and you say anything that can be used to kind of say, hey, you're racist, because you have that thought or you're asking that question, and people are afraid of that, it suppresses these type of conversations. For example, we're two white dudes, right? I'm Portuguese, but I'm white, and somebody could say, well, even us who are we to have these discussions? It's like, I think everybody should have the right to discuss everything. And I think a lot of times, like you said, it is political. It is, at the end of the day, it's the elite who doesn't give a shit about, I mean, it's like, and I've brought it up a few times of late, because it just seems like it makes sense. When you look at that movie Network, talking about movies, Network from '79 or whatever it was. Yeah. Great movie. He talks about, he's like, there is no this or whatever he said. There's no
countries anymore. It's like Pepsi and Coke.
Yeah, and DuPont and all that stuff. And that's the point. The point is, like, we get caught up in these ideologies and all these these topics about different perspectives or whatnot. But those in power only have one thing that they care about: more power. And so they'll do business. For example, the U.S., right? I mean, we're supposed to be caring about people's freedoms and whatnot. We do business with Saudi Arabia, which had Sharia law, and they do public stoning, and they're some of the most extreme religious people in the world. But yet, that's okay. And so this idea, there's all this infighting, and then those in power just continue to divide and conquer. And
this is fundamental. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you're hitting on that, because a lot of people still don't know that imperial politics is about maintaining order in the imperium, and a lot of maintaining order involves created disorder. It involves created chaos, controlled chaos. So the last talk I did on what's happening in the U.S., I called it protests, the purge and controlled chaos, where I looked at the history of the color revolutions that Brzezinski and Soros had funded for many, many years. And if you look at that model of color revolution, it's clearly a controlled chaos situation. And the goal, in the way Brzezinski used it in the Soviet bloc to create the arc, what he called the arc of crisis, of destabilization, the same model that the West and the CIA through their Islamic radical proxies have used in the Middle East to destabilize. All that does is cause the micronation balkanization. That was the whole goal. So you divide up these groups into these tinier and tinier tribal groups, and that's imperial politics. That's the easiest way to understand the way. Now, that doesn't mean that the tribal groups aren't real groups. They are. If they weren't real, it wouldn't work. But you have to understand the point that you're getting at is that there's a higher level game that's played, the game of nations, as CIA operative Miles Copeland called it in his book, which is a really important book, by the way. We did a talk on that. It's that model of the grand chessboard of Brzezinski, of playing this group off against this group, and they're not sophisticated enough to realize that it's the Pax Americana, the Imperium, that benefits from that. So, yeah, absolutely. Once you understand controlled chaos, that's a huge puzzle. Like, that makes things a lot clearer.
Yeah.
To understand the world.
Yeah, and that's what we're attempting to do. That's I've used this metaphor before, where it's like, life's a giant puzzle, and you're gathering all these puzzle pieces,
right.
And every piece of information you gather is one more piece to the puzzle. And as you connect them, maybe at the end of your journey, you won't have the whole puzzle put together, but you'll have more of the pieces put together, and you'll have a clearer vision of what that image is and what that meaning is. And so, yeah, I completely agree. Another thing you said that I think is really important, and Corbett and I have talked about this many times, how this stuff is out in the open. Like you're talking about the chessboard. Somebody can go online and order that book. PNAC. I mean, people who are in a 9/11, they know about PNAC. They talk about. I mean, this stuff was out in the open. Like this isn't, and it almost seems like you said, like, have us divide and conquer, have us all fighting. And this goes back. I mean, they've been doing this forever. The Sykes-Picot Agreement after World War I. That's how they had to fall to Ottoman Empire. Divide and conquer. And they still, they divided the Middle East, had influence here, had influence there. They never, I would talk to people. I'm like, they never, like, our purpose is never to help the Middle East actually have some peace. I'm like, they want to destabilize the Middle East, constantly having issues, because that's always going to justify our us getting involved, spending money, giving more money to Hollenberg and KBR and all these military companies. So that's always been the goal. And like when you go through history, it's just like it's the same story being told and told again. Or
there's a great book by this is going to sound crazy, but of all people, a former Soviet guy who then went into UN type stuff. And he looked at, it's Postmodern Imperium by Eric Wahlberg. Have you heard of that book?
It sounds familiar.
It's worth checking out because he believed apparently in the Soviet cause, and then he seems to have matured, and then he thought, well, the best solution is like maybe the United Nations or something like that, which obviously I'm not saying the United Nations. The United Nations is an imperial tool. That's the irony of his book. But what Wahlberg realized was that, here I was fighting for this cause and this sort of Soviet idea of reason and rationality ruling everything, and the party ruling everything, and I'm fighting the West. And then the irony of the book is that I don't know how cognizant he is of it, but he says, the very thing that he thinks is the solution to the empire, the United Nations, is itself a product of the empire. That's the irony of this book. But he's got this masterful analysis of how the Imperium works, how you basically create colonies at the outer periphery of the circle of the empire. The money from those from the colonies comes in. This has always been the model of empire. The money comes into the central locations, New York, London. It sort of extracts at a mass scale through not just the products of the outer colonies through the goods, but also it's a giant sort of vampire in terms of the economic fiat system, right? So a lot of this he figured out. He quotes Quigley extensively in the book at the beginning, I think, if I recall. But then he thinks that, well, since this giant, economic vampire entity is doing this evil fiat money, shadow banking empire, and blah, 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 maybe that we can set up some kind of, United Nations thing that will make it fit. But the irony is that the United Nations is a product and a creation of the big fiat vampire goblin. And so you realize that there's no easy big organization solutions out there. So that puts all of us who realize that in a dilemma because, well, if we're all individuals, which we are, but if we are the ones that recognize this, then how are we going to fight this as individuals? Well, you can't do much against this giant juggernaut. So that's the difficulty of geopolitics, is that you realize that there's no easy answers. So to me, it sort of forces us to look beyond. I think that there's no answers within this world. There's no solutions. I'm not saying I'm a black-pilled person. There can be victories. There can be good things that happen, but geopolitics is another one of those, just like the pedo stuff you were talking about, Nick Bryant and all that. Like the geopolitics is another big black pill where it's like, oh, there's no easy answers out of this stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's like, that's why I think philosophy has always been, like you said, there's always been a connection, or at least there should be some type of relationship between philosophy and conspiracies, because there isn't necessary solutions to all these things. It's about being skeptical. It's about asking questions. It's about not knowing what to believe and what, that's why it's funny that like the whole skeptic movement was, yeah. I'm like, wait, I thought the conspiracy theorists were the skeptics. We're the ones asking questions. All you do, like, you should be called the debunkers, because all you're trying to do is debunk people. Yeah. You're not actually being skeptical, and that's why when stories like Epstein, when that got headline news, and which was weird, because I remember it was Corbin and somebody else I had a swap cast with, and I was trying to get people's perspective. I'm like, a lot of us have been talking about Jeffrey Epstein specifically for years. And yet it was like a story that never, was never let to kind of grow and get mainstream media's attention. And then all of a sudden, like, everybody agreed that, like, we can talk about this now. And it was everywhere. And to me, it was like really weird, because I'm like, did somebody just give the green light to be like, hey, we're going to kill this guy, so now we can talk about him because we're not going to let him say anything anyways? Or what was it? But whatever it was, I was glad, because I was hoping that, and this happens every time, like a big story like this happens, and I'm like, look, all those people you were making fun of for talking about pedophilia and dark arts and Illuminati, yep, and all these crazy things, like, there's a lot of truth, not in all of them, but there's a lot of truth to what they were saying. And right now, when somebody comes to you with a theory that seems too crazy to believe, maybe you should put on the brakes and entertain it a little longer, because over and over again, things that seem too crazy to believe happen to be true. And I mean, just today I shared Last American Vagabond had an article about fluoride, giant court case, and something that for a long time, if you talk about fluoride in water, 10 years ago, where it was like, oh, what are you, crazy?
You're crazy. Yeah.
And now, like, people are starting to accept that. Same thing with the vaccines, for example. It is funny though, because it's like, a lot of people that I knew that were like pro-vaccine when it came down to vaccinating their kids, like, now they're like, oh, I'm not going to get that Bill Gates vaccine. I'm like, wait. So you'll poke your little kid with, you don't even know what's in that thing. Like, you're not reading the label. You're not asking questions. That pediatrician tells you, hey, it's time to get a shot for your little guy. You're okay to let this dude who he doesn't even know what's in it, and doesn't tell you that there's a vaccine cord and there's injuries and whatnot. And you want to talk about science. How unscientific is the idea of giving everybody the exact same cocktail of ingredients in a vaccine, and everybody's going to have the exact same response? Like, that's so unscientific. Like, I give everybody peanut butter in the world. Some people are going to love it, and some people are going to die from it. Like, it's not everybody has the exact same response, So, but anyway, so yeah, it's just one of those things where I completely lost my train of thought, and I'm trying to gather some time while I figure out what the fuck I was talking about.
Well, like the fallacy of authority, right? You're talking about just deferring to authorities, which is putting people now in quite a bind, because it's becoming really evident on a mainstream day-to-day level that the authorities are liars. Now, we in the truth conspiracy world, we've known this for a long time, because we've seen the lies since, whenever you or me woke up. If you doubted 9/11 afterwards, you maybe then you started realizing, wait a minute, the establishment, they lie about stuff. Like, there weren't babies being thrown out of incubators to go invade Iraq. That's obviously BS, right? So we know that the establishment lies, but I think for a lot of people, it wasn't even within their realm of possibility that there could be large scale lies. That was one of the things that prompted me to do the research I did in terms of my grad work, was to look at, if you look at wartime, this is a great example where pretty much everybody who knows anything about the history of wars or World War II or whatever, that's not even that controversial, is that doesn't wartime involve deception on a large scale? Yeah. Okay. Well, do you think that the establishment who uses large scale deception in wartime is somehow moral to where they, oh, well, we only use deception in wartime, we won't use it in quote peacetime? No, come on. That's, I mean, how many, it's the analogy that everybody uses of like, if you catch your neighbor stealing your mail like 10 times in a row, and then the 11th time you go out to get your mail and you know, it's your mail's not there, who stole your mail? And if the guy says, I may have done it that 10 times, but I promise this 11th time I didn't steal your mail. Oh, come on, right? I mean, it's like you're being, you know, taken for, you're being a dupe, you're being an idiot, a schmuck, right? So I think that now it's on people's radar. It's within the realm of possibility that they're starting to realize, especially since the coronavirus and the protests, that, wait a minute, something doesn't match up here, right? We're not supposed to touch each other, but you can go out and protest. Like, that's, now we're in full on 1984, you know, Smith world, right? Where, because if you remember, he tells that to Smith, he's like, I'm going to make sure that I tell you contradictory things and you have to believe the contradictions. Don't just tell me that you believe the contradictions. I want you to convince yourself that you believe the contradictions. That's the stage that we're at now. That's the scary part.
Are you in Florida? Did you grow up in Florida?
I grew up in Tennessee. I lived in Florida for last year, and then I moved back to Tennessee because I got a deal on a house.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, because I was going to ask you how Florida is doing, because I know my wife has some family down there, and they're opening things up. Things, you know.
Yeah, I just went down to Florida for a week, so I just got back a couple of days ago. Yeah, most things were open.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Tennessee, we're like, it's almost back to normal. Totally, Tennessee.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, like, we need rebels like Florida, and you know it sucks because Florida has been the butt of many jokes because all crazy people live in Florida for a long time, and but like they've kind of proved that, like, hey, look, everything's open. We have a bunch of old retired people here. Everybody's, you know, for the most part fine. I think people were super naive to the fact that while we're going on with our everyday lives, people were dying. And now, like, if you just televise those numbers and let people know that people are dying every day, people panic. And it's like, listen, before this virus, guess what? People were dying. Like,
people were dying, exactly. Yeah.
Hospitals were full of people dying. Like, people who worked at VA hospitals, there's people dying every day, in and out. Like, that hasn't changed. And just because you're aware of it, it doesn't mean that now this is this. And I think if you televise anything enough and you scare people enough, you can scare people. It's the same way you scare people into going into wars, like you said, deceiving. And that's the thing about wars. Like, for example, Vietnam, everybody agrees Vietnam was a giant fuck up, right? And yet, like, you know, Syria comes around and we're like, yeah, we should go into Syria, or we should go into Libya, or we should go, yeah, Venezuela, because they're socialists or whatever. It's like, yeah, well, we use that, you know, socialist term to invade a lot of countries in Central America that we probably shouldn't have. And so, like, we get.
Are we going to invade China?
That's
I mean, if we're going to invade the socialist countries, right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because another thing I've been mentioning on the show, it's funny how, like, the right is like, hey, don't get tricked into believing that Russia's the boogeyman. But by the way, China's the boogeyman. And then the left is like, hey, don't get duped in believing that China's the boogeyman. Russia's the boogeyman. And it's like, you're both being duped into believing that.
Yeah, I had a meme that was good on that. And it showed two NPCs facing each other. And it was like the elite above. And then it was like making these two NPCs fight about who the boogeyman was. But it was illustrating that very point. Yeah.
Yeah. That people just get, they get tricked into believing this. And it just, but what amazes me is that regardless Epstein's story, the coronavirus story, people, even if they have like this second where they're like, oh, you know what? Like, maybe everything I thought I knew was a lie. Quickly, a lot of people get back into the same patterns. And then when they're lied to again, they believe the status quo again, where, why is it that some people get stuck in that pattern over and over again, where like they can watch the pandemic documentary and be like, oh my God, like this whole thing's bullshit. And then like a week later, they're like, well,
yeah,
numbers, and I'm like, wait, the numbers? What you mean, the false positives and the all the fact that every prediction has been mostly wrong and all that, like that, none of that matters. It is. Do you think some of it is really that, like we talked about in earlier in the podcast, the fact that it is dark, it is scary, this idea that thinking that everything you thought you knew could be untrue, and that is a scary thought to kind of deal with and digest. So ignorance is bliss. Maybe it's just easier to kind of just believe what you're being told.
Well, I think that when the CEOs and executives and engineers from the social media companies came out and they were talking about how, oops, sorry, we screwed everything up. We messed up society with this government-funded private-public monstrosity where we created these control systems that now wreck everybody's social life. Sorry about that, by the way. They even discuss how the way that the feed was constructed was destabilizing. I read an analysis of this a long time ago where they said that when the social media takes over and you have the infinite scrolling feed, it will have the effect of destabilizing people's worldviews, because there's always this infinite flow of data and information, and there's always a new update. And so you don't feel like you can ever get a grasp on an objective truth or fact about any situation, because there's always more information, there's always more papers, always more articles. It's an avalanche of data that has the effect of relativizing people's paradigm and perspective. So I think that was actually also weaponized. I think that was done on purpose. And they even talked about how the whole like system and the scroll system, and it was all created to just make you an addict to the feed. I think it also had these other effects for promoting the idea of people not being able to come to truth. And so what that does is that puts people into a apathetic state of just, yes, like you said, I just surrender, I give up. Like, so whatever they tell me this week, okay, yeah, whatever, fine. Yeah, last week it was killing millions of people. This week it's magically okay. Next week it'll be back killing millions of people. And yeah, so that's what it's to cause you to give up.
Yeah, there's a book called Merchants of Doubt, and it kind of talks about the strategy a little bit. This idea of like, all you have to do is plant the seed of doubt. Like you just have to throw out some bad information, some fake information, some conflicting information, and people will be overwhelmed and just like, well, I don't know what to believe. And that's what you were hearing over and over again with the coronavirus, was that I don't know what to believe, so I'm just going to stay home. I don't know what to believe, so I'm just going to give up all my rights and be alive but not have the right to live. And it's
well, this alone, by the way, disproves the scientism narrative that you were hitting on in the first hour. What are you supposed to do when experts disagree? If we're going to defer to the scientific experts, what happens when you have two classes of scientific experts telling you radically different things?
Yeah, and that's why I think the censorship issue really got just blew up during the whole coronavirus thing, because you had experts in their field being censored. And like right. During that Swapcast, like, they have decided for us what is truth. They have decided for us which expert, if they have a narrative, then it's like, I'm just going to take the expert that agrees with this, or the narrative, it's going to push the narrative I want, and I'm going to say this is truth, and I'm going to suppress everything else. And it's like, people should have the right to look at all positions, all perspectives, and come up with their own conclusions. Yeah. If not, then it really is some higher power saying, we're more knowledgeable than you. You're too dumb to decide. Let's. Well,
it's the will to power thing too. It's not just that you're too dumb. It's also that they literally say, we are going to determine what's truth. We are going to tell you. It's what Smith tells Winston in 1984. He's like, I'm not just going to ask you to tell me what I want to hear. I'm going to make you say what I say is true, even if it's not. Even if I say I'm holding up 5 fingers, or I'm holding up 4 fingers, I want you to actually believe that there's 4 here, not just say that there's 5. say that this is for. I mean, they literally have that level of Nietzschean will to power to where they're just going to say, no, I mean, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter what's true. It's just purely power play, will to power.
Yeah. And that's why I think that this censorship thing, it's definitely a good time for all of us to come together and
absolutely
try to find some solutions and convince James Corbett that we're not trying to get him to join a cult, and he doesn't have to donate it. I kind of expected that response. I mean, the cool thing about James, a lot of the way I do my show is similar to his, because like any artist, you take influences from people you look up to, and you kind of use that in your own work. But all my stuff's open source, So one thing that James is notorious for is, like, anytime somebody says, "Hey, can I do this with your work?" he says, "Yeah, I don't care what the question is. Yeah, just do it. Put it out there. Make stickers, make whatever. And I'm very similar to that. So I can see how the idea of, like, well, we trying to get everybody to join one group, but it can be a little off-putting for some people. It's like, no, we're not. Nobody's trying to do that. I think the one goal is so people can get James Corbett's documentaries. Like the Fed documentary was one that was notoriously suppressed, had millions of views, and yet if you put in the title exactly the way it was worded, his version of it didn't come up. So and I'm sure same thing with you. I know you were demonetized on YouTube and whatnot. So
I had videos with that I'd done, one about the Hollywood type stuff, and it was fast going. It got up to 220,000 views, and then it just stopped. Wow. So they will do that, absolutely.
Yeah. That's so hopefully we can come up with some solutions, because I think these, like, this was one of my favorite podcasts I've had in a long time, because I usually you were talking about one topic and whatnot, but I love, like, kind of like the philosophy perspective on things, like the asking questions and not really saying, like, hey, I'm gonna just bring information and this is what's right and this is the perspective I'm sharing with you, but it's more about, like, exploring perspectives and asking questions and coming to the conclusion that there is no conclusion, and I think that's really important, because I think that's something that we should all be doing. It's taking time to if it's spirituality. I know Sam started, like, some side project spirituality podcasts, or people who do psychedelics. I've had Dennis McKenna on, Terrence's brother, and we talked about, and I've talked about it with many past guests, just the benefits of probably doing psychedelics, or something to kind of make you I don't know, almost like put a shock to the system, where it's just like, okay, maybe there is a higher power, maybe there is something more, maybe there is, let me get out of this rhythm of this cycle of materialism, where we become machines, where we're just doing the same thing all the time. And so
you have to watch my bad trip stories. I have some videos where I tell my bad trips. Yeah.
Is that on your YouTube channel?
Yeah, I'll send it to you later.
Do you still do mess around with dibble dabble with things, or no?
Not with hallucinogens.
Yeah,
I did a bunch when I was 18, 19, somewhere in there.
It's weird how some people, like, discover it with age, right? Like, it's almost like you do it to just have fun when you're young.
Yeah.
And, like, I did edibles not too long ago, just because I'm like, dude, I haven't done anything like that. My drug of choice is, I like whiskey and I like wine and I like a cigar, and to me, I like to just be in the right state of mind, relax, kind of just gather my thoughts, but edibles and stuff like that, I'm like, like, now I'd be doing it to try to have, like, some spiritual moment or some self-reflecting. Rogan said it, and it's so true. Like, this idea of, and Aubrey Marcus has talked about it too, where so often we look in the mirror and we have all this bullshit that, like, we can convince ourselves of, like, that we're a great person, and we're always critiquing what other people are doing and how they can improve and how they can be better people to us, but we never, or we not often.
Well, they do force you. Yeah, they'll force you to do an introspective journey, for sure.
Yeah. So I think that's super important, because a lot of times you realize you might come to the conclusion that you might not be a good of a boyfriend or a husband or father or whoever you are. Like, you might have flaws, and to make you realize those flaws is a step in improving on those and really becoming better as a person. So I think we need these type of conversations, and we need those type of experiences. So but I know I've taken up a whole bunch of your time, Jay, and I apologize.
That was a great talk, man. I'm glad we didn't do the typical, standard interview. This is a lot better with just kind of free flowing stuff, because I get tired of doing the same old, tell us about your book, tell us about it. This is way better, dude.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. That's probably like the one niche that I have here, is that I have, like, I've had Burton C. Bell on my show from Fear Factory, this electronic artist, Cell Dweller, and who's big in like electronic music scene, and anybody that I have on, like I try to just have a casual conversation, and it might go down a bunch of really interesting roads, and that it would never go down if I just focus on, let me just talk to them about their music, or let me just talk about
exactly.
And to me, because people are, in many cases, people are much more complex than that one topic, and I'd like to kind of explore all that. So,
and I'm actually, I wasn't going to tell you this because I don't want to come off like a douchebag, but I'm almost to the point where I'm going to say, when I get asked to do interviews, I'm going to have this disclaimer, like, we cannot do the interview that I've done 100 times. Tell me about your book. What did you do this last year? What are you trying to promote right now? Like, just have a conversation with me. That's way better than, that boring interview that I've done 100 times.
Well, the whole point is, like, for me, like, one thing I loved about podcasting, and I'm sure, you doing a lot of shows and interviews, it's similar to you, is like, conversation is so powerful. If you're willing to kind of put your ideas and perspectives out there and challenge them and let your own opinions and be challenged, you can gain a lot from it. And I tell my listeners all the time, like, this isn't just a journey for the listener. Like, when I say my slogan, for lack of a better term, is like provoke thought, start a ripple. And it's like, it's not just for the listener, it's for me. Like, I'm growing. When I first started this show, I'm like, I don't care if one person listens or a million people listen. Like, I know I'm gonna get something from this. And if one person listens and gets something from it, it's worth doing. And so, like, these conversations for me, like, I've learned something from this conversation. And
look at the popularity of Joe Rogan. I mean, that conversational model is obviously what's more appealing to people than just having one guy bark orders at you or tell you his view. I mean, you can do that, that can work. That's what I do in the lectures, but this is a lot more fun. It's a lot more entertaining and enjoyable to have actual human conversation rather than just me lecturing at you.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, like, this, I haven't made this into a business. This is just a passion project because I'm awful with business. So I'm just going to continue it as a passion project. But it to me, like, if I was doing a typical interview, it would feel like work. Then eventually it's like, well, I'm not making money doing this, and it feels like work. What the fuck's the point of doing this? A quick story before you go. Like, when I had Jesse Ventura on some years ago, like, the day of the show, I got an email from his team. I don't know if it was his agent, manager, whoever it may be, saying, hey, so these are the things Jesse wants to talk about, and these are the questions he wants you to ask, and all this stuff. And I'm like, wait, have they not listened to my podcast at all? Because I'm like, I'm like, that's not like the format at all.
Yeah,
like,
right.
It's a casual conversation, and usually I try to state that in the email so people kind of know. And so all day I'm at work, and I'm like, oh, he's one of my biggest guests. I'm like, how am I going to handle this? What if I piss him off? What if so, like, I have this internal dilemma all day. I'm like stressing about it. And then, like, the show is about to start. I'm like, listen, if I start asking questions like this, I'm like, I'm gonna suck, because I'm like, I'm just not good at doing those type of interviews anyways. And two, like, he might never come on my show again. Who knows? I might never book him again. So, like, why not just take advantage of it and have a fun conversation and do it the way I know how to do it? And so I did, and it ended up being an awesome conversation. I didn't ask him any of the questions, they asked. That's and cool, we talked about a bunch of stuff.
Now you're gonna get a suplex. Now he's gonna come and suplex.
and then he offered to come back on again. He's like, oh, great conversation, and James Corbett, same thing. I remember back in the day, he'd always be like, hey, what do you want to talk about? It probably because he had so many different topics you could invite him on for. And I'm like, oh, maybe we'll talk about this. And, like, just about every early James Corbett interview I did with him, I always ended the show by saying, sorry, James, we didn't talk about any of the things I told you we were going to talk about, because I just kind of let it flow. But it went down some interesting roads, that I think it would never go down if you, kind of stuck to a script. So yeah, these conversations are definitely fun for myself too, and I'm glad that you enjoyed it and weren't like, hey, what the fuck, you didn't ask about my book or anything like that.
No,
But
I'm actually tired of talking about that stuff. So that was great.
well,
yeah, thanks, man.
before I let you go, one last plug. Can you let people know where they can get your work, your channel, all that stuff?
Yeah, I got 2 books, pretty highly rated. So I don't think you'll be disappointed if you get the books. If you go to my website, they're available in the shop, signed copies, and then all the lectures and talks that I've done on the elite books and whatnot, you can get that at my website as well by subscribing. It's, as I like to say, it's a grad education for $5 a month, so you can get it there. We got a lot of happy subscribers there, and then the channel was demonetized, but I am still putting stuff up on YouTube, so you can follow me on YouTube and Twitter and Instagram and all those things as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jay. I really appreciate your time.
Oh,
And
also the TV show at Gaia TV, by the way.
oh, that's right. Yeah, because you're on Gaia, right?
We did 1 season of a show, yeah, and then I was on 3 or 4 of their shows, but mainly, yeah, just my TV show. That's what I'm most proud of, is that TV show. So
That TV show. Yeah, I have. Is there any way of watching it without subscribing to Gaia?
I can send you. Yeah, I can send you one of those. Yeah.
Because I found it. I just didn't. I'm like, well, do I have to subscribe to it? Or
yeah, I mean it's a paywall, so I don't own it. They own it. So
yeah, I mean it's hard to hate, the fact that there's a paywall, because that's how they continue to put out stuff. People,
I'll send you. I got a link that I can send you though. I can't do public, but yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, awesome. Well, have a great Friday, great weekend. I'll send you the links once it's up and live, and feel free to post it, share it anywhere you want. It's all open source, and we'll hopefully we talk again in the near future.
Awesome, man. Thank you very much. It was an honor.
Hey, same here. Thanks, Jay. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Take care.